Hello and welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage, in the beautiful, sunny, somewhat crisp state of Maine in the first week of November. I love all things Halloween. I went trick-or-treating with my son. It was a perfect night for it, actually quite warm. The moon was out, but the sky was kind of spooky, if you will. But every year it surprises me when you wake up the next day and boom, November. What happened to October? Now we're bearing down on winter, which makes, if you live in snow country, every year, somehow it happens over the summer or the warmer months, you get things spread all over the yard, and now you have to put them back in order so you can make way for snow removal. So I need to do that still. Every day this week I intended to shoot a video. At the end of the day, and the end of the day fell apart. So today I'm going to do it first thing. I have lots of work to do, but let's talk about GM 4-speed transmissions. That's the subject of today. In 1957, General Motors put the Borg-Warner T10 in the Corvette. The Borg-Warner T10 was made in different versions for different auto manufacturers, each having its own case and tail housing, input shaft spline, output shaft spline, length, so they do not interchange. So General Motors had their version in 1957. This is the first design T10, not the Super T10. But in either case, a Borg-Warner T10 can be designated by 9 bolts on the side cover. This transmission has 7, that makes it a Muncie. We'll get to the Muncie. I can't attest to the strength of the original Borg-Warner T10. I have never had one in a vehicle that was mine to abuse and try it and find its limitations. I do know they fetch pretty good money if you happen to have one that has the correct VIN for a rare car, like a 409 Chevy or a Corvette. As a teenager, I had bought a bucket of parts, early T10 parts, and I had it at a swap meet, and a gentleman came along, decoded the VIN, and paid me what I considered at the time a lot of money for that stuff. As late as a couple weeks ago, I took one in trade. This one, a cast iron case version. In the early design T10 came in, I believe, aluminum, cast in aluminum. I think they always have a cast side cover, but you can't swear to that. I don't know. I haven't done all my research on that. The times we live in now, you can go online and find out all these details, which is really handy. I'm not going to quote a lot of the exact specs today, other than we are going to ID a Muncie that I have over there off camera. But the early design T10 did its job, and it was in the the fabled 409 car, so it must have pretty good strength. In '64, General Motors decided to build their own in their Muncie plant. So all Muncies have a serial number that starts with P, and that's not for passenger car. That in their world stood for Muncie plant. The first designs, and this is a '64 right here, maybe they came out in '63. Either way, the internet will tell you. This is a '64, late '64, with a 7/8 pin on the cluster shaft. In later years, they went to a 1-inch. All cases have, for the main case, the tail housing, the side cover, they all have a part number on them. And that is the fastest way to figure out which case you have and its features. The tail housing will call out whether it's passenger or driver's side speedometer, and each one had their own nuances. And it will tell you what year ranges each one came in. In this case, if you were trying to ID this transmission, you'd find it had a December '64 case and a much later tail housing, because I just stuck this together for a dummy. It's handy when you're mocking stuff up, which I'm going to use it in the Willys pickup soon enough. Also, the early cases don't have a drain plug. That's kind of a pain. They have a fill plug, but no drain plug. They fixed that in later years. They probably saved a few pennies by not tapping the hole. You can drill and tap it yourself. I've done plenty of them. Now I got all dirty. I had to pause and look it up. 1963 was the first year that GM introduced the Muncie transmission in several choices, determined by the first gear ratio. They had the wide ratio M20, the close ratio M21, and eventually the fabled M22, which you'll find very rare. A lot of people think they have one. The Muncie we're gonna ID, I'll show you why they think they have one. The one I have is not, but I'm a wide ratio guy. If I'm shopping for a 4-speed transmission, I want the lower first gear. Now lower is higher numerically, and vice versa. So if you have in the rear end a set of 410 gears, that's a low ratio, but higher numerically. And vice versa. If you have a set of 308s, that's lower numerically, but considered a higher gear. So the ratios were determined by the RPO code. In this case, M20 is your wide ratio, M21 is your close ratio. And all your M22s were close ratio. And before I forget, I'm not sure I already mentioned it, Muncie's, as far as I know, were always aluminum, aluminum, and aluminum. All the pieces were aluminum. Occasionally, maybe the bearing support might have been cast. Again, there's different variances, and there's a lot of websites dedicated to just that, which are really helpful in determining what you have. Most all your early 4-speeds up into the late 60s, maybe 69, definitely by 70, the higher performance transmissions, the M22 for instance, went to from the 10 spline input to the 26 spline, and went from the 27 spline output, the same size as the TH350 and a Power Glide, they went to the 32 spline Turbo 400 size. So a lot of people get confused about that. They think if they have a fine spline and a big output, they have an M22. Nope, they offered them in all the ratios all the way until 1974, until they stopped making them. Now in any transition year like 1974 and beyond, they held on to the RPO code, M20, M21, but now under the floorboard was a Borg-Warner Super T10. The Super T10 had come along in the late 60s and GM decided to adopt it in 74-ish. I can't tell you why, but I'm glad they did. In my mind, it's a superior piece. A lot of people love their Muncies. I broke every one I ever had. And the T10s that I had, I didn't break, knock on wood. But then again, I was at the end of my 4-speed drag racing career. So career is kind of a misnomer. But the Borg-Warner Super T10 was offered in many ratios. The wide ratio, I believe, was a 243 first gear. I'm just going by knowledge. I know my favorite one is the 264 wide ratio. I have 2 examples over there that I'll show you. But they continued to get crazy. Now this is the 70s, late 70s, up into 1980-ish. At the dawn of automatic overdrive starting to come out and swapping to the T5 overdrive transmission in the 80s cars. We're jumping ahead a little bit, but the writing was on the wall for more fuel economy. So GM did what, like for instance, I showed you the Doug Nash 4+1 5-speed that I have mocked up in the 56 210 Handyman wagon. GM did the same thing with the Super T10. They spec'd out a super low first gear ratio. You'll find one of those, the Borg-Warner Super T10 ID'd the ratios by the number of rings on the shaft. So did the Muncie. So, like my favorite 264 wide ratio has 3 rings. They made them up to 6 rings. It has a 3, I'll have to look it up, or you can look it up yourself. A gear ratio in the 3s and they ran a really high rear end gear. For instance, I have a couple 80 Trans Am rear ends out back with a 249 ring and pinion. Coupled with this low gear, that's a poor man's overdrive. You get the acceleration because you have a low gear, and you get to cruise on the highway because you have a high rear end gear. The problem with that is the lower the first gear ratio, the weaker the transmission is. I covered that a few weeks ago when I was talking about the TKO 500 and 600. The 600 is a stronger transmission because it has a higher first gear. The 500 has a lower first gear, which inherently makes the transmission weaker. And the Super T10s, much like the original version, came, most of your performance cars, if you got one out of a Corvette or a Camaro, it's probably aluminum, cast side cover, steel side cover. They did have iron versions. Again, they had their rhyme, their reason. I don't typically know why that choice was made. I prefer the aluminum, and whatever has a side cover, typically cast. The T10, Super T10 is much more robust. The Muncie's had a tendency to spread the case. The later cases with the big input and the big output were better for that, but eventually, you know, as the transmission got stressed, the gears would spread apart. You'd get out on the tips of the gears and shear them off. And I don't know if I covered the M22. I don't think I did. The reason why those got a reputation for being loud, they're not straight cut, but the angle of the gear is angled down towards straight more than the typical helix on the M20 and the M21. And that made them stronger but louder. So lots of people really enjoy the whine of the M22. I think you can hear it in some old movies and stuff like Two-Lane Blacktop. So it's just one of those noises, car noises that people like the Detroit locker in the rear end made a lot of noise, but that's its calling card. You know, the M22 made a lot of whining noise. By the early 80s, all the fabled 4-speeds were gone. During the 70s and 80s, there's one more 4-speed I have to mention. It's not a performance transmission. It was offered, is a Saginaw. You can tell a Saginaw right away by a couple things. One, it's all cast iron. Two, all three levers, first and second, third and fourth, and reverse, are all on the side cover, whereas the Muncie and the Super T10, 1, 2, 3, and 4 are on the side cover, and reverse is back here on the tail housing. So if you're looking at a transmission and all three levers are connected to the side cover, you got yourself a Saginaw. Those are good transportation only, maybe in a super light hot rod. We used to use them for wheel chocks. Nowadays they sell for good money. And for whatever reason, I mean, hey, it's still cool to shift your own gears. You could get into a whole debate of whether which one's faster. I can tell you all the 4-speeds I talked about today are inherently weak. You know, the power output of the day, traction that was available. I mean, you have your LS670 Chevelle and your M22 and your 12-volt rear, you've only got like an L7815 tire, so bias tire. You know, traction has come a long ways, and traction will be the death of your transmission. I raced with a 4-speed with a relatively small slick when I first started racing right out of high school, and I didn't break too much stuff until I put stickier tires on it, and then you start breaking parts. And then in the 80s, they went to the overdrive that I spoke of, the T5, which is also very weak. I am a fan of the Super T10, and that is, for whatever reason, the only one that the aftermarket really picked up on. It was, you know, still to this day is a very popular choice for drag racing, drifting. NASCAR used the Super T10 with the side linkage up until they decided they needed to move the driver closer to the center of the car, and the linkage was in the way. So they went to the top rail transmissions, and they ran that right up until the new version of the car that you see this year. So the old Super T10s still have quite a following. I just picked one up the other day, and I'll show you that too. These are the only two GM Borg-Warner Super T10s that I have left. They're both 3-ring, 264 first gear, and neither one's ever had the side cover off, by what I can tell. I have not ID'd them as far as what they came out of, but I will someday for fun. I use these for mocking up the shifters that I build, and someday they'll end up in a project. I had quite a few of them. I've weeded it down to only having 2, but I'm always on the hunt. I'll tell the story of this Borg-Warner T10 another day. It's actually made by Rankin, R-A-N-K-I-N. They were a supplier to NASCAR. This is a clutchless or clutch assisted, if you will. Some people call them dog box racing transmission. I just picked it up the other day, pretty happy about it. That's a subject for a whole video by itself. I took this Muncie and trade the other day, and just for kicks, let's ID it. Say you're at a swap meet, you walk up to it. If you've done a little bit of homework, you can figure out what you got. I went ahead and shined up the area because you can see the part number for the main case. This here, believe it or not, represents the 12 months of the year. So 2 dots is January. The I6 would have been the mold, but this is the most important number. It'll get you in the range of the year the transmission was built. Over here, the P number is what's important here. P3A2OA. So, P, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, is Muncie plant. The 3 is 1973. A is January. The 2 and the 0 is kind of funny looking, but that's the 20th day of the month. And A, this particular version, the later Muncie's, told you what it was, ratio-wise. There's an A, it's an M20. Also, there's 2 rings on the input. Also designated an M20. I might as well ID the whole thing as best I can. The main case is a 1969 to 74 1-inch bore for the countershaft pin. The 2 dots means the second week of January, because the first month is where the 2 dots are. And like I mentioned, I6 is the mold number. That's the tail housing part number. If you look it up, it's 1970 to 74, passenger side speedometer, 32 spline output, and has a wide fin on the back, the support fin. The side cover has a part number on it as well. This has the improved pivot pin. It has the later style forks that take a bolt, and this is actually longer. If you look at all your old Hurst levers, for the stud style, there's a spacer, and they made the arms the same in the later years, so they fit both styles, but you need a spacer for the stud style. And there's 2 bosses here. This one would have been for a neutral start switch, but it's never been threaded. And this is transmission controlled spark. It flipped the switch when you went into high gear, and early emissions equipment. And lastly, the most important set of numbers is this partial VIN right here. Now, decoding a partial VIN is not like reading a normal VIN. You kind of got to do some interpretation. But in this case, I believe the first 3 are the most important. 13S, 1 is Chevrolet Division, 3 is the year, which we determined over here is a 73, and S would have been Camaro, I believe LT Camaro even, because Camaros could also be had with the Saginaw, I believe. So if that was a Z, if that was a 13Z, this would be a 73 Corvette, but it's a 73 Camaro, I believe. I don't know, in 1973, what other vehicles you could get a Muncie in, other than the Corvette and the Camaro. Nova, potentially, but Nova and Vega were cheap cars. Cheap cars got the Saginaw. So, interesting. I'll have to do some research on that as well. As far as the shifter goes, the mechanism, General Motors used their own version. The later ones, I believe, was made by ITM. And in a lot of vehicles, you could also get a Hurst shifter. The Hurst shifters OEM installed were often different than the aftermarket ones. The adjustment and the bushings, I guess they probably tried to keep them quiet, where your Hurst shifter may rattle a little bit. The Hurst shifters, you can have plastic bushings in the linkage, or if you're cool, you had the brass ones, because it's, hey, less slop, the tighter the feel. Most of your OEM shifters are not good. The Corvette shifter, I believe, was actually mounted on the cross member, and of course the motor and transmission vibrate. Not the best setup. So that was a brief rundown, mostly of the information floating around in my head. I had to cheat a couple times after I talked about something to go back and get the facts. I was pretty close. I've always loved shifting gears for myself, but as you know, I also love automatic transmissions, so it's okay to love them all. I'm often tormented, when I'm thinking of a project vehicle, which direction I want to go. So it's good to have a little bit of both, I guess. But the fact is, an unpopular fact, that this is a very limiting factor in your performance. You can buy an aftermarket racing transmission like I had sitting over there, or better, and you can go pretty fast with those. People are still going fast. The H pattern record just got reset a few weeks ago. Meanwhile, the Turbo 400 has yet to find how quick you can go in a vehicle with a Turbo 400, because that is the most popular racing transmission going right now. And granted, there's very few, if any, OEM pieces left in it by the time you're going, a 3-second 1/8 mile. You probably don't have the Turbo 400 out of your grandfather's station wagon. So, but it's a derivative of it. So take that for what it is. Have a wonderful day. I'll catch you in a couple days. The last couple days stretched into almost a week, but I'll try to do better. Have a great day.